Are we ready to start? Okay, fine, perfect. Well, it's my pleasure to chair this session, which is going to be a little bit shorter because we have lunch in an hour, and I know how important lunches are. People get impatient. We have two papers. The session. This is in fact the continuation of the previous session, Jews in Poland, Poles in Israel. And we have two speakers. So I would call upon the first speaker, Benjamin Brown from the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, who will talk on the Poland of yesterday in the eyes of the Hasidim of today.
Thank you.
Minutes.
Thank you for the presentation. As Simon Signoret once said, nostalgia is not what it used to be. Hasidic hagiography is nearly always nostalgic, or at the very least glorifies the past, particularly the past tzaddikim. However, comparing the Hasidic hagiographical works from the beginning of the 20th century to parallel literature from the beginning of the 21st century, one can discern a number of prominent differences, whether in genre, style, topics, or the descriptions themselves. I will point at a number of these variances, but before I begin, I would like to state that I can't comprehensively discuss all of them. I'll focus mainly on those regarding pre-war Poland. And even before I begin, if you want me to sum up the whole issue in a word, Poland of yesteryear is presented as the lost Eden, a utopia of warm, deeply rooted Hasidic Judaism. This message may appear banal, but as I'll try to show in a deeper analysis, more thorough analysis in the light of earlier works of Hasidic literature, it's not self-evident at all in any respect. But let us begin with differences. The Hasidic hagiographical literature of the 20th century was comprised almost exclusively of short stories, at times nearly miniatures, about past tzaddikim. Most of the works were not devoted to one person, but rather to several tzaddikim. But even when a work was dedicated to one person, it was not generally structured in an ordered biographical narrative. The stories exclusively depicted the tzaddik or a group of tzaddikim, while everything else was mere decoration. It is hard to find detailed and straightforward descriptions of the town under the question, or its residents, landscape, and ambience. One must generally extract these details by cleverly reading around the author's intended focus. Additionally, the narrator observes from distance, only rarely entering the story himself and as an active participant. The genre of first-person narratives, well known from centuries of memoirs in Western literature, is almost completely absent from the Hasidic literary corpus, even as it was adopted by other Orthodox Jews in Eastern Europe. All of this has changed. Collections of stories written in the old style continue to exist today, but they have become rare, relatively, as they have been eclipsed by a range of new literary genres. I will dwell on two of these genres, biographies and memoirs. From the 1970s onward, biographies of Hasidic rabbis and more recently memoirs of Hasidic elders have gained wider acceptance. These two genres could be viewed as a regeneration of classical works of Hasidic tales, but still different, as I would say. In the following remarks, I will focus primarily upon memoirs, but it is important to mention a few points about the genre of biographical works as well. In contrast to storybooks of the past, these biographies of Hasidic rabbis are written systematically and in a chronological order, beginning with the Rebbe's forefathers, continuing through his birth, youth, marriage, period of leadership, and concluding with his death. At first glance, this quasi-academic style seems to fall apart when the biographies quickly spiral into compilations of anecdotes, including some belongings of the old style, belonging to the old style. However, these are in fact organized by topics, as each chapter seeks to present a particular facet of the Rebbe's personality. Thus, for example, many multi-volume books filled with anecdotes depicting the lives of the Rebbes of Ger, Belz, Alexander, and many other prominent tzaddikim, which are nevertheless systematically ordered. An even more remarkable genre is that of the memoirs of Hasidic elders. The authors are not necessarily figures who enjoyed a close relationship with the Rebbe or other rabbinic leaders, but rather run-of-the-mill Hasidim seeking to portray their own view of the past. An example is the recently published book Days of My Living, Yemei Megurai, it's a pun in Hebrew, containing the recollections of Berl Tzishinsky, a Gerer Chosid, plain Gerer Chosid, and the past resident of the town of Gur Kalvaria in Polish. The book was published in this year, 2017. The narrative is told from the vantage point nearly non-existent in classical Hasidic literature, as I said, first person. Interspersed with questions from the editors. The book takes on the form of interview from time to time. This is a format which also completely absent from classical Hasidic literature. The editor, which is Tzishinsky's son, is aware of this new genre, and he writes in the introduction why he adopts that. He says, it is true that the Hasidic, I'm quoting, it is true that the Hasidic elders were not accustomed to record their memoirs in writing, he says, and most were transmitted orally. However, at that time, we enjoyed the company of Hasidim from that time period who served as a living reminder, linking us to the glorious past. Today, as the population of survivors dwindles, and there is hardly anyone left who remembers in its days of glory, we see great importance in recording these matters in print so that they may endure for many years. Unquote. Tzishinsky's book is characterized by its considerable and at times exhausting level of detail. He writes extensively not only about the Rebbe and his saintly sons, but also about many other characters present in the narrator's surroundings. An entire chapter is dedicated to the town of Ger, beginning, of course, with the Rebbe himself. However, aside from the tzaddik, there are perhaps primarily the descriptions of the atmosphere surrounding the Rebbe and the tremendous admiration of his followers, the tremendous admiration that his followers had towards him. Having said that, the chapter proceeds to extensively detail the town, a brief account of its history, extent, population, and landscape. This is followed by an articulate report of the layout of the town's streets and buildings, where the post office stood, where the train station stood, where the hospital was, and so on. Descriptions of this type, it must be stressed again, are totally absent in the old style of Hasidic storybooks. In these new memoirs, the Jewish shtetl of Poland are illustrated as in an exceedingly idyllic manner. All is infused with holiness, purity, piety, studiousness, and social harmony. As in the case of Hasidic literature, dispute and internal conflicts are disregarded or blatantly ignored, while even societal and economic troubles receive scant attention. Discussions of economic hardships generally appear in order to demonstrate how nobly the Jews endured the life of poverty, or to show how they were rescued from poverty by the virtue of the divine salvation by the actions of the Rebbe. While the societal woes, such as crime or anti-Semitism, hardly receive any mention, do not actually receive any mention. All of this is, of course, preceding the Holocaust, about which a number of authors do recount their bitter experiences. Consequently, pre-Holocaust Poland is portrayed as in an entirely utopian light, and the authors themselves do not hesitate to say so. I shall quote two excerpts which are typical in content but radical in degree. Tzishinsky writes, and I quote, "If I wanted to sum up Ger, the Rebbe, the surroundings, the atmosphere, and the shtetl, in a few words, it would be as follows: an introduction to the Garden of Eden, an introduction to the world to come." His words. In the memoirs of another Chassid, Ephraim Londoner, titled "A Bridge to a Wondrous World," thus, the editor writes in the introduction, I quote again, "Somewhere in Poland there was an enchanted and perfect, world. Beyond the pillars of smoke of the awful inferno ignited by God, there was a Garden of Eden on earth. And there was also, beyond the oceans of blood, the choicest of human creation, which was bled like water." Unquote. What about the non-Jewish surroundings? What about the anti-Semitism, which gained momentum in the years leading up to the war? Somewhat remarkably, the Hasidic authors do not allow the Gentiles to mar this idyllic picture. This too is a notable difference. When classical Hasidic literature, Gentiles are generally depicted as wicked Jew haters, in the contemporary publications such figures are placed delicately, I would say, nearly concealed in the background. If there is a particular depiction of violent or anti-Semitic Gentiles, such portrayals are not applied to all, or even not to the majority of Gentiles. Indeed, Gentiles are present yet absent in today's Hasidic literature. The impression is that the non-Jews live out their lives in large Hasidic cities and villages, while the Jewish shtetls enjoy the seemingly pure and holy environment in which Jews lived separately from the Gentiles, who appear only as extras. Jewish life in these places, particularly towns in which the Rebbe resided, was so rich and vibrant that the Jews could ignore the world around them and live solely within their own surroundings. The fact that Poland was, after all, a non-Jewish country only strengthens the Hasid's sense of separation from the outside world, and consequently, the sense of purity and sanctity within. Here, too, perhaps it is worthwhile to cite Tishinsky. Once again, almost, a selection not representative, but not necessarily the only thing, the most important thing that I could bring. Here, and I quote again, here in Israel, he says, the situation is different. Today, we live in the special air of the land of Israel amongst Jews. And among other things, we also do travel to the Rebbe. In Poland, we live amongst Gentiles. It's true, there were many Jews and many Hasidim, but the feeling was one of a diaspora among the Gentiles. And when we arrived in Ger, yes, we felt that we had left the diaspora. So there were Gentiles all around, but when we came to Ger was a Garden of Eden, all separated, all under the wings of the tzaddik. And he continues, how typical it was that one would ask his fellow, where is Warsaw? Where is Warsaw? And the answer used to be next to Ger, of course. And he adds the explanation, Warsaw was the capital city of Poland, home to hundreds of thousands of Jews, aside from non-Jewish population, while Ger was only a town of about 800 families. Warsaw is near Ger. It is interesting to note that not only do Gentiles not mar the idyllic picture, but neither do non-normative Jews. It goes without saying that these books do not depict Jewish crime, prostitution, or the like. As I stated above, these works do absolutely ignore societal and economic woes. But furthermore, even ideological criminals do not occupy a prominent place either. At most, Maskilim, Zionists, Bundists, and advocates of assimilations are secondary characters, if at all. However, in this matter, I do want to distinguish between the two literary genres I've just mentioned, that of the Rebbe biography and that of the memoirs. In the Rebbe biographies, there is almost always a chapter dedicated to the struggles of the Rebbe. The hero of the story against the modernizers. This chapter generally describes the efforts of these dissenters to undermine traditional education, rabbinical authority, the observance of the halacha, and how the Rebbe stood firm and relentlessly maintained opposition. One almost never encounters failures. Either the Rebbe is presented as victorious, or the biography simply avoids a report of either successes or failures. In any case, there will be very little attention given to these modernizers in the remaining chapters. It's one chapter dedicated to this issue. In contrast, memoirs written from the point of view of ordinary Jews have no need to portray these characters at all. For these Jews had no involvement. Involvement in public affairs. What about relatives or neighbors who took different paths? As we know, and we have said, these books have no interest in mentioning such imperfections. Consequently, only on rare occasions do memoirs make any reference made to such types. There are exceptions, some exceptions, but basically they're successfully preserving the utopian atmosphere. One could go on at length presenting further perspectives and examples for this. However, at the end of the day, this will not add much. I mean, it can refine the picture, it can strengthen the picture, but basically this is the picture. We've come to the conclusion that we have two new genres, and a utopian depiction of pre-war Polish Jewry. And now, how can we explain both of them? Regarding the existence of new literary genres, that is, the well-ordered biographies and the memoirs, the simple explanation is that the Hasidic writers have been influenced by genres prevalent in the culture surrounding them. Just as the aesthetics of books are different than those of previous generations, so do their manner of expression. That is what sells, so that is what the authors produce. But how can we explain the utopian portrayals of Poland? What stands behind it? Here it seems there are several factors. One cannot claim that Poland was actually so wonderful. We know that it was not the case. Furthermore, we have seen that the authors of these books needed to overlook a number of uncomfortable elements in order to construct their utopia. We are confronted here with we're confronted with deeper needs. First of all, there is a great nostalgia for Poland, I think, overstepping the regular human bounds of nostalgia due to the destruction of the Holocaust. In the Holocaust, if the Holocaust divided the lives of survivors into two halves, life before and life after the Holocaust, this fault line continues to be sharpened with the passage of time. Poland does not merely represent itself, it represents childhood, parents, friends, and everything else symbolized by the Jewish life of the yesteryear. In addition to this, it must take into account the widespread doctrine of the decline of generations, which is, as I once said, the 14th principle of faith in the Haredi world. And one could say that, one could add that the sanctification of diaspora, Mendel Pieker's term, is an intellectual trend which has developed largely as the anti-diaspora attitude of Zionism. All of these explanations are correct, but only to a certain degree. The narrators could have constructed nostalgic and idyllic recollection of Poland without transforming Poland into a utopia, into a perfection, a paradise lost. The need to construct a utopia is an independent drive which stands apart from the other needs I've just listed. So indeed, why do people write utopian literature? It's a general question, I think. And one of the scholars that coped with this question is Lyman Sargent. I'll refer to him in a minute. When Thomas More, for example, wrote it, or Francis Bacon wrote their utopian books, what was their purpose? If they were aware of the vision, that their visions are not capable of realization, why did they feel need to imagine them and in such great length and detail? The authors of classical utopian works most likely did not ask themselves this question, but the philosophical movements and research which followed in their wake did. And here, Lyman Sargent, in this popular but insightful book of Utopianism, summarizes the existing research into 6 primary motivating factors of writing utopian books. Sargent addresses societal and political utopias and dystopias, but his remarks, I think, with necessary adjustments, can quite be relevant to religious and other utopias as well. And I quote again. Literary utopias, he says, have at least 6 purposes, though they are not necessarily separable. A utopia can be simply 1, a fantasy. It can be 2, a description of desirable or undesirable society. 3, an extrapolation of the present. 4, a warning. 5, an alternative to the present. Or 6, a model to be achieved. I would like to add a 7th purpose to Sargent's list, which is coming to terms with that which cannot be radically changed. Indeed, at times utopias do not awaken the aspiration for radical change, but the contrary, highlight the unrealistic, unnatural, and hence unattainable nature of the desired goal. And therefore, perhaps somewhat paradoxically, allow one to come to terms with the inability to fundamentally alter the nature of things. This is true regarding future utopias, and it is true regarding past utopias as well. All of the depictions of utopian Poland emphasize that Poland of yesteryear is forever lost. And if so, the necessary conclusion, unstated by and probably unconscious to the authors, is that the only choice left for us is to come to terms with our own flawed world, to accept it as it is, and not demand too much of it. The past is indeed receding away from us, but Poland continues to inspire Hasidim, if not through memory, then at very least through imagination. Thank you.
Thank you. It was really fascinating, and the timing also was perfect. So thanks a lot. And now we have the second paper of this session, Kamila Dąbrowska of POLIN Museum, and the title is Narratives of Expulsion, Polish Jews in Israel after the Polish anti-Semitic campaign of 1968.
Okay, so good afternoon. As I was already introduced, my name is Kamila Dąbrowska and I work in the POLIN Museum, so that's where do we start from. And today I would like to present you a paper I titled The Narratives of Expulsion, Polish Jews in Israel after the Polish anti-Semitic campaign of 1968. So just a brief introduction. The paper is based on my PhD thesis, which was written at the Warsaw University, and the title of my PhD thesis was From Autobiography to History, Constructing Individual and Group Memory Among Jews Living in the Lower Silesia region after the Second World War. Long one, right? So few methodological remarks at the beginning. So how did I construct my research? So what was crucial for my research, I was combining history and anthropology as two tools seeing each other. The starting point for my research was the need I felt that the overwhelming interpretative model perceiving post-war Poland as only the land of graveyard and ashes should be changed. By creating the counter-memory to the dominating collective memory, I wanted to underline the importance and the uniqueness of post-war generation of Polish Jews. What I have done is, as I said before, I have combined two voices from the past, the documents from the past and the interpretations of the historians together with the live histories of my interviewees. Now, where all the story starts from, in my case. So the story started at the Lower Silesia region, so-called the regained territory region, which was given to Poland after the Second World War. So after the war, many Jews expected communism to create a just society. They regarded the new order as a promise of support and encouragement to lonely and desperate people. The communists seems to favor Jews. In the first official document of the new communist government, Jews were the only minority explicitly mentioned, quote, Jews who were subject to inhuman tortures by the Nazis occupier are guaranteed full rehabilitation as well as legal and actual equal rights. It's a quote from Manifesto of Polish Committee of National Liberation from July 1944. So the concept of a New Zion, it was an idea of building a Jewish settlement in a region of this regained territory, so part of Poland, contemporary Poland you might find here. That these lands were, let's say, emptied from the Germans, and there were houses, there was non-destroyed industry, and there were working places for those ones who were settled down there. In case of numbers, it's hard to imagine from the whole population of estimated by the historians is 250, 300 Jews who survived the war, almost 120,000 were settled down in Lower Silesia region. Of course, due to the next waves of migration, the settlement was shrinking, but still at the beginning of 50s, it was about 32,000 Jews living in that region. At the beginning of 60s, so after another migration, it was still about 15,000 Jews living in that region. So you could see how in the scale of the post-war Poland the settlement looked like. To understand how this post-war period functioned, I should add a quotation mark at the end, whether it was really a Jewish autonomy. So I divided that period into 3 different, let's say, periods within the years 1945 and 1969. The first one is called by Artur Grabski the period of autonomy, Jewish autonomy. It was the time in between 1945 and 1950. So then at that time, the Polish authorities decided to grant Jews recognizable autonomy, allowing them to establish the central community of Polish Jews, called in Polish Centralny Komitet Żydów w Polsce, as the political representation. The committee was a kind of an umbrella institution that included different Jewish parties. Between 1945 and 1950, the Central Committee persisted over an extensive network of local and provincial Jewish committees that oversaw a range of social welfare initiatives, educational and cultural institutions. Of course, as we all know, the post-war violence damped the hopes that Jews might safely rebuild their lives. After the Kielce pogrom, about 70,000 Jews left Poland. With the imposition of communism in late 1940s, all Jewish political parties were dissolved, and independent political life was stifled. Zionists, religious Jews, together with private business owners, were identified as unwanted within the borders of Polish state. So the next wave of migration started. In between 49 and 50, it is estimated that 30,000 Jews are leaving Poland, going to Israel. The next period I call the period of being in between, is the period starting from 1950s till 56, 57. It's the time of Stalinist repressions, which soon turned out to be the time of living in between. So those ones who did not manage to leave, they were still hesitating, so still thinking about leaving Poland. It was the time of living in between the private life, which created some kind of protective cocoon, and the terrifying life behind the Iron Curtain. The only organization which was enabled by the Polish communists to exist was the Jewish Cultural Social Association in Poland, so-called Towarzystwo Społeczno-Kulturalne Żydów w Polsce, that emerged in 1950 from the chaos of painful changes. What is interesting, the status of the new association was written according to the instructions given by the Communist Party. The content of the statutes underline not only the importance of closer bonds between Poles and Jews, but also a Jewish adaptation of the progressive Polish culture. It's a quote from the statutes of the association. Even though the anti-Semitism was condemned officially and considered as a crime, the political changes of 1956 were accompanied with the return of anti-Jewish so-called incidents. Those incidents, of course, did not reach the level of the immediate post-war violence. However, they triggered the decisions of many Jews to leave country, and then the borders were open for them, so they might do that. So in between 56, 57, but it lasted a bit longer, about 39,000 Jews are living again in Poland, going to Israel. Who is left here? So the next period I call the period of young generation. So those ones who were born after the war and started their adult life in new land, new Poland, new country. The so-called thaw in mid-50s initiated the liberalization of the political system. Dynamic migrant movements, because it's also the time of the second repatriation from the Soviet Union of the Jews, affected daily reality of the shrunken community. The children born in post-war years represented almost half of that community due to the post-war baby boom. After the nationalization of Jewish organization in 1949, young Jews could still remain in the institutionalized Jewish circle, as the system of state-run minority schools with the Yiddish language taught and cultural clubs run by the Jewish Cultural Association was established. The official structures of education and child minding had to follow, of course, the ideological guidelines of upbringing, which required to build a positive attitude towards communist Poland and the Soviet Union, together with the sense of national identity. Jewish children were brought up as a committed and loyal Polish citizens. Now I would like to present you a collective picture of this two post-war generation. Of course, there are significant distinctions between the pre-war and post-war generation. It's a result of different historical periods which shape their identities. Now I will concentrate, of course, on those Jews I have been doing the research among, so those ones who lived in the Lower Silesia region. The picture would be slightly different, or maybe not slightly, but quite different if you would like to concentrate on Jews who were living, for example, in Warsaw. So the generation of parents had shared the similar life experiences. They were born mainly in traditional families, mainly in small towns of the pre-war Poland. They survived war mainly in the Soviet Union, while their families were killed here, I mean on the territory of Poland. What is also interesting, they had basic or almost non-education. The research done at the beginning of 60s among the Jewish population in Lower Silesia proved that from 25 to 30% of the adult population had just primary education. They believed that the new system will be safe for the Jews, and however the scale of identity choices was again in between keeping some kind of patterns of the pre-war lives and then just rejecting them completely. What was unifying for them, they wanted their children to be Polish citizens with some kind of Jewish identity. What about the children? So they were born in between mid of 40s and end of 40s, in that period of 5-6 years. They lived in nuclear families with a wider network of constructive families based on non-biological bonds. What does it mean? The so-called reconstructed Jewish families that were created among those ones who were coming from the same pre-war towns, or they survived the war at the same places, so their life trajectories during the war somehow intervened. The lack of intergenerational transfer of family knowledge, the absence of broader family, coupled with parent silence, and created some kind of continuous sense of fragmented and incoherent life story. Those kids attended mainly the state-run minority schools with Yiddish language I mentioned before, or so-called TPD schools, so Towarzystwo Przyjaciół Dzieci schools, so Association of Friends of Children schools, which had no Catholic religion being taught. The Jewish ideologies choose Yiddish language to be the main point of reference to the post-war Jewish identity of young generation, with a slogan: culture should be national in its form, but socialist in its content. The young one began soon to criticize the concept of restoring the remote, in their meaning, Yiddish culture in its artificial post-war version without any connection to the living Jewish culture, in their opinion. What is also important to notice that due to the support of Joint Distribution Community, a charity American organization, the whole network of Jewish youth clubs and summer camps and winter camps was able to be created. So those young ones dispersed all over Poland had the place to meet and to meet each other. As for the crucial generational experience for the post-war generation of young ones, it was the anti-Semitic campaign launched, of course, in 1967 after the Six-Day War in Israel, with its peaks following the March 1968 and its long-lasting consequences. We might use the term introduced by Karl Mannheim, saying that those disturbing moments serve as crystallizing agents of the formative processes to the generation. What was that for that young generation? At first, it was a violent and sudden shock. It was confrontation with hate speech, but what was mostly painful for them is the social indifference they felt during that period. Suddenly, from one day to the other, of course it was a process, they were excluded from the Polish majority they felt part of. They were deprived of Polish citizenship, they were deprived of Polish language, of Polish culture, because they had to leave Poland. The symbol of that humiliation is the small document you might find here, so the travel document, in which it was written that the holder of document is not anymore a citizen of Poland. Just to remind you numbers about the emigration waves after the war. So the biggest, of course, it was just after the war, then the one I mentioned at the end of 40s, then mid of 50s, and the one I will concentrate on is the migration after the anti-Semitic campaign. One can ask, so how many Jews left Poland? We know more or less, but where did you go? So according to the documents of Joint Distribution Committee and Hayas gathered in Vienna, where the Polish Jews had the first, let's say, stopping point after they left Poland, about 3,300 came to Israel from the whole number. It is estimated that to other countries, but mainly to USA and Canada, it was about 6,000. And Scandinavian countries who opened their borders for the Polish Jews, so Denmark and Sweden, it was about 3,000 Jews who settled down there. Why Israel? Maybe it's an obvious question because we are at the Polish-Israeli conference, but it was not obvious for Polish Jews at that moment. First of all, when they look back at past and being asked, why have you chosen Israel? They often reply, because I had to have my own country, where I will be a full right citizen and nobody in the future will deny that I have rights for being a citizen. It was kind of rejecting the so-called hybrid mixed diaspora identity because they have chosen the Israeli as that one which should construct their life in the future. Of course, it was an issue of relatives and friends who might support them while they came to Israel. It was not easy. It was not easy, as the time following the expulsion was, of course, the exile from the previous identity. The long-lasting, and it lasted for more or less 10 years, I would say, of loss, despair, and disorientation. It was also the time of building new identity and the process of acceptance, new meanings, and social configuration. How did it go in Israel? So, of course, those ones who decided to come to Israel, they were entitled to receive Israeli citizenship due to the law of return, as you know, issued by Knesset in 1950. What has changed in 1970, that they also put an additional law enabling the Jews from mixed non-halachic origin to receive an Israeli citizenship, which was crucial in case of the Polish Jewish immigrants, because some of them, they came from mixed marriages where the wives were not Jewish. What kind of structural solutions were then existing in Israel? Of course, there was the widely known organization called Sochnut, so the Jewish Agency for Israel, which was responsible for the whole process of Aliyah. But then in 1968, due to the large wave of immigrants, the Ministry of Absorption was created or established. The end of 60s was still a time when the Ministry of Absorption and Sochnut still did not divide their duties clearly their duties towards the new Olim. Of course, they have provided language courses, ulpans, the absorption centers where the Olim could live up till 6 months, learning language and having the accommodation and food for free. Also, they provided for those young students, as you can see the picture of one of my interviews, the free education and the whole system of scholarship, which enabled them to continue the education in the university. It also provided a financial support and good loans for the apartments they had to buy after they leave the absorption center. Of course, this whole structure of, let's say, structural solutions, how to implement or how to assimilate the new Olim, went also with ideological assimilation. Now I would like just to refer to 3 points. So first is the religion. In the report of Ministry of Absorption from 1970, the halachic issues and lack of Jewish identity were pointed out as those making the absorption difficult. The problem was also with mixed marriages, as I mentioned, because even though they got the Israeli citizenship, they felt still not to be a full right citizens of Israel. So most of my interviews decided to convert within few years after they came to Israel. The issue of secular upbringing in the communist Poland resulted in Israel with large scope of problems, daily problems. The young ones were not familiar with religious traditions. The holidays were unknown for them, and the basic know-how how to behave within the religious surrounding was not internalized. What is important that the secondary socialization came with their children. So children attended schools, bring the Jewish rituals, Jewish traditions to their homes, and taught their parents more or less. What about the reception of the society? It was not that warm as they expected, and so the official authorities understood that only structural solution is not enough. So the propaganda campaign started being introduced in the newspapers. So the Israelis were encouraged to invite new Elim to their places during holidays. It did not work really well. As for the army, almost right after their arrival and after finishing universities, they were conscribed. Most of them did already participate in Yom Kippur War. So those pictures are made, just before or during the Yom Kippur War. The young Polish Jews soon became part of the system, internalizing the official narrative, as one of my interviewees said, quote, "During my military service, I always thought that if during the Second World War, Israel and Tzahal existed, maybe the massive destruction of our nation would not have taken place." One of my interviews underlined also the importance of the war experiences, saying, "They provided us war and military service, so I got to know boys. And we had then topics to discuss, so I started to be one of them," end of the quote. The issue of international politics is also important in that broad picture. As you know, Poland broke the diplomatic relations with Israel after the Six-Day War, and for the Israeli citizens, so immigrants from Poland, it meant that they could have no physical contact with Poland. They could not come, they could not visit their friends, they could not visit their relatives. So what has happened? I don't know if you know, they had the contacts through Scandinavia. The Scandinavian countries were used as a meeting points for those ones who left. They have been sending letters, parcels, using their families and relatives in Scandinavia. It worked. However, they could not come to Poland, even though Polish authorities did not want to issue them permissions to come when, for example, the parents were dying. They were not able to come. So how this local diaspora looked like and why it was created in Israel. So the answer is pretty simple. It was established to overcome the sustaining feeling of alienation. Circles of friends with so-called Polish marriages provided support, security, but also the identity coherence. Within Polish networks, a unifying platform was based on language, collective rituals being practiced in particular spaces chosen by the group. The language nostalgia refers, of course, to books and music. As I was telling to Alina during the break, they have their own cabaret team, the Zespół Szwagrów, who use this some kind of folkloristic language to refer to their own past experiences, but also the contemporary one from Poland. But they also read Polish books, and they use this kind of so-called pidgin language, I would say, mixing Hebrew and Polish on a daily basis. Their collective rituals, as you might find, is celebrating Christmas and New Year's Eve, which is, of course, not common in Israel. So they do it in private spaces or in Russian restaurants where they rent the space to have those their collective meetings. If one would ask how big is the group, I would say that the group which has daily contacts, it's about 200, 300 people in Israel, no more. Just to finish up and to sum up my paper, I would like to tell a few things about this transnational community, because of course Jews went to Israel, but I was mentioning before, they also end up in Scandinavia and some other countries, United States, Canada. So at the end of 80s, they had their first gathering in Łódź, where the previous post-war pupils of Jewish schools gathered. And they decided that they have to organize this transnational meeting of Jewish pupils and those ones who attended Jewish summer camps and winter camps organized by Tes Kajet. So in 1993, they organized the first reunion in Ashkelon. And they organize it each year. This year they will have it again in Nahariya. And Nahariya is important because it was the biggest gathering of the immigrants. It took place in 1993 and it gathered about 1,000 people. So just to end my paper, I would like to say a few things about the mixed memories of those immigrants, referring also to your paper related with the memory and how memory is constructed. So, like others violently displaced from their homes, my interviewees' memories were in many ways negative and bitter. However, I observed ambivalent remembrance involving the mechanism of splitting among Polish Jewish immigrants. The ambivalent remembrance of past experiences consists of two elements: the traumatic memory of gradual failure of the equality dream, and the mythologized affirmative memory of the uniqueness of Jewish life in Poland. Those two narratives of the past are repeated during the reunions and collectively approved. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. We have 10 minutes for questions.
Well, my question is to Ben. This was a very interesting paper. I think the urtext for all these nostalgic memoirs is Abraham Joshua Heschel, Life is the Lord's. And I think this was widely read, translated into Hebrew, and people used it as a model. I don't know whether this is your impression.
Heschel is considered out of the line for the Hasidim of today, maybe indirectly, but indirectly it could have influenced. Yes.
In the same vein, actually, this nostalgic image of the shtetl in general goes back to neo-romantic Jewish, Hebrew and Yiddish literature of late 19th century, because almost everything, one by one, of the facts of the depiction of the shtetl, such as the purely Jewish environment, the positive nature of the non-Jewish world, the marginality of the non-Jewish world, or things like that, you find it in, I must say, the classics, at least of Yiddish literature, depiction of the shtetl. So I'm not so sure as well that Hasidim today in Israel read Sholem Aleichem, but for sure this is something which is in the air, because this kind of image actually was in the mind of many Israelis and many North American Jews for the last 3 or 4 generations. So it's kind of it's a belated response or belated accommodation to something which is part of the I would say ongoing conversation of orthodoxy and modern Judaism.
That could be one explanation. Another one could be that it's a similar psychological pattern.
So I had just 2 quick questions, but I think they were both sort of asked, but I want to raise them again. I mean, Heschel was one that immediately came to mind. I mean, it sounded exactly like Heschel, but the issue of the American, have you read the art scroll material of the last 20, 30 years?
Can you speak louder?
Have you read the art scroll hagiographies that are coming out in the last 10 or 20 years? And to what extent are these similar or different than what's happening with American Hasidic hagiography?
Can you name one or two? So I did encounter some of them, I guess, but
I don't
not
claim to
of
be-
the same
I-
type I mentioned here, but maybe.
I wouldn't admit to having any on my shelf, so I can't.
Okay.
But if you
Might
haven't
have gone
looked,
through
it might be kedai to think about how it's going differently or similar. I know that Shaul Magid has an article out on those hagiographies, because it's also developing. And it's also being influenced, he argues, by things like Heschel and things like Vishniak, that they are not admitting to reading these things, but they clearly are being influenced by them all the same. So it might be something worth exploring.
Interesting. I'm taking that into attention. Thank you. Attention.
Kind of anecdote to Camila. You will find now these days that we have a Facebook. So I found in the Facebook there's all kind of group, in a way nostalgic group, especially in Israel, that they share their memory and nostalgia to their Polish Israeli experience. So the comments, the discussion there are very, very interesting. What they have what are the memory they are sharing? What are the mutual, especially as you said, the mixing of Hebrew and Polish all together, how it's very, very vivid in their memories and everything. So this is another thing that's going on today in a way to, it's not only the real meeting, is the encounter via the social media and everything.
Yes, I forgot to say, but of course they meet in the virtual space on a daily basis. There are two newspapers called Plotkes and Bulletin Reunion, but of course it's the exchange through the social media, which is, became present at the beginning of 90s and still gradually involving many of them into the daily discussion. So that's true.
Just to go back to Professor Brown, right here. Another famous memoir that came to my mind is Sefer HaZichronot of the Rayatz, which I think has most of the characters you described.
It's not a memoir book, in fact. It's called Sefer HaZichronot after the book of the.
But that's the genre.
But
right?
it's that was by the way studied by Professor Batal among others. But you spoke about Sefer HaZichronot, wrote but Sefer HaZichronot is in kind of an invented history of the more remote past, rather than memoirs in the clear sense of the word.
It's not Zichronot.
It's called after the Sefer HaZichronot in Book of Esther. It's yes.
I also have a question for Benny. Did you find anything that you thought was undocumented or interesting or worthwhile reading for historians of the interwar period in these memoirs?
Sorry? Once
So
again?
did you find anything that was exceptional beyond the ideological structure? Was there any reflection of undocumented phenomena that we didn't hear about or that would be worthwhile reading for an historian?
You mean hard facts in the
That
sense of
surprised
historical value of
Yeah.
hard facts? It's an interesting question. In the memoir books, as far as I remember, I couldn't find any. It's much more interesting in terms of atmosphere and personal perspective. Quite unexpectedly maybe, but in the biographies that are more of kind of pseudo-scientific pretensions, there they often publish new documents which are very helpful to the researcher, and quite some of them are really used by researchers, especially when they're brought in the original. I mean, it's sometimes they give photocopy, not just quote them. That's very helpful. Chassidim are often really sitting on personal archives that you can't find in any other group that I know. But really, just plain Chassidim, of rank and file Chassidim, are often really equipped with personal documents that they inherit or gain or by themselves, and this is sometimes it's really something that you can't find anywhere else, and when they publish it, it's really worthy.
These autobiographies
in
contain
biographies you can find them from time. For example, Rosh Golat Ariel, which is the biography of the Imre Emes, the Gerer Rebbe that passed the war and actually the first to immigrate to Eretz Israel. You find no few documents that were first published there.
I wonder if this phenomenon of which you describe could be seen also as a reflection of the past. So if we take into the consideration that the Orthodox and the Hasidim of Ger, especially, have had quite good relations with the Polish government with the Piłsudski regime, at least. So, and the Jews in the interwar period were treated mostly as a religion with some special rights to live this religious life. It could be also explained by, some historical.
So do you suggest that the utopia was true?
No. But why this group is more positive to Poland than the secular Jews, for example?
I see. Interesting point to think about. Yes, but once again, as I said in my paper, you have to distinguish between someone who really presents the past as positive and as more sublime than the present. That's one thing, but to present something as a utopia, as an idyllic thing, perfection in their words, is something else. This should be explained by other models, I think, of motivation, which is it's different in the sense that idyllic picture of the past or a pleasant picture of the past is something that you can explain by mere psychological, personal, even collective memory terms in the sense of collective memory, in the naive sense of the world. A utopia is something of societal, even political message, tacit or overt. You choose, but when you depict the whole society and a whole period in terms of a utopian picture, it means something more than just a kind of personal dreamland. It says something, it has some message to the public. And here, I think it's not just a memory of the past, but some kind of message to the present that those people try to convey.
I can take one more question, and that's about it, because we've finished.
Okay. Sorry. I'd just like to say, coming from the Haredi world myself, I think this utopian thing shouldn't be isolated from the entire Haredi system of education and media. And this goes all across the line of the Haredi world and society, that everything is utopian. We look at our greats as our rabbis, as holier than, the further back you go, the holier, the greater, the closer to Matan Torah. And you won't find also in Yated Ne'eman, Amevasa, all the Haredi media, you'll never find any description of the shtetl life that Haredi society tries to recreate in today's world. You won't find anything about also information about other movements, secular Jewish movements, and the shtetl was always used as an example of the only Orthodox, as if only the Orthodox existed there. And I don't think it comes so much as you say. Probably you have other reasons too, but I think it's more just the Haredi way of depicting that world, idyllic world. Let's take Lithuania as an example. We talk of the yeshiva world, the Litvish yeshiva world. You'll ask any yeshiva bocher in Israel about Lithuania, he'll think that there were 1 million yeshiva bochrim just like in Israel today. Everyone's sitting and learning. And if you try and you show him in the pinkas of any community that there were very few religious Jews in a various shtetl, or that there were non-from Jews in the Mir shtetl of Mir, and he won't believe you. He'll say, Mir? It's a
holy town.
Holy town. And in Mir, there were probably a majority of non-religious. So brisk, and so all the names that mean so much to every Haredi growing up in today's society, and it means spiritually, and I'll talk about it tomorrow a little bit. So it goes together with utopia. The same as Shivchei Baal Shem Tov Shivchei Ari It's all educational. It's all it can't be objective, because part of being Haredi means you cannot be objective. It's part of the, as you said, the 14th Ani Mamin. That is Haredi society. Emunat Chachamim, the all holy. If you talk about any figures from the Tanakh, from the Mishnah and Talmud, they were all holy and perfect and born great people, which isn't true, but this is part of being a Haredi. That what the Haredi is saying, it can't be true. En tzaddik ba'aretz yaseh tov v'lo yachta. Okay. And that's what Ba'anche Kodesh Tiuli, this parasha we read yesterday, the Kotzka, yeah? Because Malachim have enough. Angels have got enough, they're all holy. But there's a mitzvah in the Torah that normal people should be holy, because a normal person isn't holy. But obviously, this is Kotzk, and this is already something else. But I would expect the Geras to be a bit more Kotzk in the hagiography, but obviously, it doesn't go that way. And the minute a Rebbe becomes a Rebbe, you can't even, the Ger Chassidim don't even call him by the names.
Sure.
Before he was called Yankel, not even Reb Yankel, Yankel, and the minute he's a Rebbe, you can't say his name. Almost like half a god. So what I'm saying is, this is the Haredi society, and at this background, you can understand better the utopian image, so to speak. But I don't think it's, as you said, it's not intentional at all. It's just, that's the Haredi way of writing history of teachers, of rabbis, of Hasidic Rebbes. And so too the shtetl serves also as an educational means. And therefore the shtetl is always only Haredi, which is obviously not true. Thank you.
Okay, just to respond in a word, 2 words actually. One word is that exactly, that is what I'm trying to say when I said that it differs from the early Hasidic or classical Hasidic literature. When I spoke about contemporary versus classic, contemporary means a part of what you call Haredi, and you rightly mentioned, and by that it's maybe important to add, because it's a part of the subject of this conference. When they addressed me to talk about, they asked me to talk about Poland in the Haredi educational system. Educational system doesn't really refer to Poland. It's not a subject in the educational curriculum, but as I said then, and I can repeat now, hagiographic books are an educational means, just as you said. So it's a part of Haredi education. So thank you for adding that.
Thank you. Well, let's the last question, please. But please be brief, because we are late.
Short and brief. It's not an question. It's sort of I would like to offer Benny some other perspective. As you know, it's became very common for Hasidic groups to travel to Eastern Europe. When I reviewed their programs, they never visit any shtetl. They go from one grave to another one, to second, to the third, to the fourth. The shtetl is not there. So it doesn't, correlate with the process which you presented as idealizing, the shtetl. The shtetl is not there. Just the Rebbe's grave.
Worth thinking, okay. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the speakers.
Thank you.